You're making an interesting point. I mean, I think for that reason, large pharma got burnt by licensing in phase 3 products that were really phase 2B. I'm wondering to what extent, are the relationships, which clearly are increasing and becoming much more strategic between pharma and CROs, to what extent, are those relationships changing a lot, both financially and in terms of risk sharing? There seems to be a component where pharma is looking to offload some of the risk of their development program to the CROs in addition to more of the work.
I do agree with that. We are seeing more of that in the industry. The CROs are stepping in. They obviously can't take all of the risk because, as someone had pointed out at a conference, they're not in a position, if they were to get sued, if there were something wrong, post-marketing, to come back, that they can't handle that kind of risk. But the risk sharing is going on where the CROs are stepping in, they're taking on the employees, they're buying the physical spaces, and they are assuming that kind of risk. And the other thing I was thinking about was also the regulatory burden, as you're talking about the smaller companies, the biotechs, and they really want to bring that drug through. Well, the drug ultimately has to get approved. So if you're not thinking through all the things you have to do for the regulatory, you might not just get burned on the safety and the efficacy, but you might get burned just in something the FDA or EMA asks for. So
somebody once asked me, how can a company spend $700 million and 10 years and get to the FDA and something that they miss something? And my answer was, I don't know, that's a good question. I think people underestimate the complexity.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Lisa, Kyle, and Ben. And for the audience, I want to tell you that it's not over. So we hope that you can stay around and join us for overtime. And we want the conversation to include you. So please feel free to log on to pharmafaceoff.com. Give us your feedback on both this show and your thoughts on this subject or any other. Thank you.
Barbara, I wanted to go back, if I can, to the therapeutic areas that you mentioned, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, and cancer, because I think they represent a really different challenges in innovation and bringing value. Because in cardiovascular disease, we understand it pretty well, and we have a lot of medicines, and the question is, what do you add on to make it a little bit better? On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Alzheimer's disease, where we have nothing that works. And I think that everybody would agree that if we did have a drug there, it would be a blockbuster. But we just don't understand the brain well enough. And then cancer is very odd, and I know that Kyle works on this, but we had some success with targeted therapies, and we thought, well, we can extend that 2 months of survival advantage into 2 years if we use it more optimally. But cancer has been stubbornly difficult to address, and not only has it been difficult to figure out good combinations like we have in cardiovascular disease and earlier use, but a lot of the times, even when we have a VEGF inhibitor that works great, like Avastin, it hasn't really replicated that the next VEGF inhibitor also works.
I'd agree. The idea of, or the kind of traditional thought in areas like cardiovascular or infectious disease or a number of other areas is that, well, the first generation drug will do a certain amount, and then each drug that follows on it is going to be a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. And we haven't really seen that in oncology and in the targeted therapies. In the early days of their development, I think that the concept of, the not really understanding the target, what enzyme we're looking at or what pathway we're inhibiting, but not really understanding the target population. So there's this pathway, but it's more likely in a female non-smoker of Asian descent, and yet we identified it in a smoker. There's just a lot of slight confusion that has led to really colossal mistakes in the development area, the wrong trial design, the wrong population, and an attempt to sort of get that broad indication, which is where, everyone sort of thinks, well, I want the broadest possible indication, but then you're spending a lot of money on a lot of people who aren't getting a lot of benefit.
Right, which kind of brings up, I guess, what you mentioned earlier in terms of the personalized medicine and targeted therapies, where obviously we've seen the most work done in oncology.
Right, there's a lot of use of the biomarkers and in the trial design, trying to get the right endpoint in an oncology trial must be for these companies extremely difficult because there are debates in the community about what do you measure as the endpoint for a true endpoint in an oncology trial. So, you know, it gets down to you want to advance medicine, but you have to get it approved, so you have to go through the certain processes, and then you get down to problems with finding the right people, the inclusion-exclusion protocols, collecting the data, and it becomes just complex. So although we talked about efficiencies, having efficiencies in a therapeutic area, you think you can build on that, but it actually goes from being simple to more difficult, more complex. And
We see this real tension that you're talking about between, okay, I'm a pharmaceutical company, I want to design a trial for an oncology drug. And the academic community, my experts are telling me, be creative, be aggressive, use this endpoint. And yet I'm worried that the FDA is only going to look at this endpoint that they've accepted in the past. I have to show overall survival. I can't subset by all these different biomarkers and call that a primary endpoint. And so their solution, by and large, is to do both. And that gets very expensive. Mm-hmm. And you want to be creative and show that your drug really does have a place in the armamentarium. And you also don't want to get up to the FDA at the end of the day and have them say, well, you didn't do the gold standard test.
I guess, you know, too, in hepatitis C, we're going to see, you know, this in living color with the proteases, in that, you know, it's very, very complex. And obviously that both Vertex and Merck have done the trials looking at selective patient populations. And you can't really even compare one drug to another based on the trial results that are reported because of the vast difference in the underlying population. And then looking at, you know, which patient populations may actually benefit from a shorter duration of therapy. So there's a big scientific advance, but at the same time, it's become increasingly complicated.
Right, it's not necessarily a commercial advance.
I do
Well,
think
we're hoping that it, or some are hoping that it will be a
that would be an
commercial
exception
advance.
and be a real blockbuster.
Right. But, you know, one of the things you'd mentioned as the trial starts to shift and we see, you know, the academic community and the clinical community accepting various surrogate endpoints, but the regulatory community lags way behind. You know, complete response rate in myeloma, and it took a decade after clinicians were accepting complete response as a surrogate for survival before regulatory would accept it. We're 20 years on from when we started showing real utility to PET scanning in assessing response and assessing burden of disease in various malignancies, particularly in the lymphomas. But it's really only now that the regulatory environment is catching up and, okay, yes, you can use that as an endpoint or a qualification criterion.
In the FDA's defense and the EMA, it's a tough job.
Oh, absolutely, and they get battered from every side, which is why I think they're like a pendulum. They rarely are exactly in the middle of what makes the most sense to the most people. They get pressured heavily from advocacy groups to move things forward quickly, and then they get heavily pressured when they've moved things forward quickly and the longer term data is showing, you know, complications either for safety or not as good a survival advantage, and then they have to swing back the other way. It's not a job I would want to have responsibility for.
And the end result plays into exactly what we've been talking about. It just makes things take longer. The FDA will wind up making the right decision, but may take an extra 3 years to do it. That's just increasing costs and increasing timelines for all these pharmaceutical companies as well.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting situation where, you know, we used to accept that if you lowered cholesterol, that was a good thing. And now, after Zetia and Vytorin, you know, you've actually got to show that more patients have fewer cardiovascular events to get a drug on the market to lower cholesterol. So we're back to the drawing board.
In a sense, that's a good thing. We're moving to we have good enough medicines now to do certain things, and we need to show that the patients are actually benefiting, living better quality lives and living longer. In diabetes, you need to show that you're not just improving glucose control, but you're improving cardiovascular outcomes. In obesity, we found out the last couple of weeks that the FDA cares that you're not just losing weight, but you're actually getting healthier.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, it to a certain extent, I think this is a problem that the industry has created for ourselves. You know, almost every company in their mission statement that's about curing this and helping that and better lives for patients. And yet we really whine a lot when the bottom line isn't really coming up to play. But eventually all of these things are coming together to a better outcome for the patients.